A new coach on the farm, the Final Four full of powers, and what did Deion Sanders' contract extension mean? This is the College Gameday Podcast. We are recording the day after April Fool's Day. Rece Davis, Pete Thamel back with you for the first time in a while. Pete and I have visited, obviously, on TV. We've talked about Pete's lack of a tie on College Gameday basketball and which transfer portal member to blame for that. But good to be back with you on the pod. Pete, you don't strike me as an April Fool's kind of guy. Were you on the receiving end or on the delivery end of any April Fool's joke yesterday?
So I'm a veteran of April Fool's jokes. I had an NFL scout text me something about Oregon State joining the Big 12. He said, "Is this true?" I said, "No, it's April 1st." And he said, "Oh, they got me." So I did not. I was not the subject or target of any tomfoolery. I would hope I'm skeptical enough in my job that I could see through that. When we broke Buzz Williams going to Maryland, there were a few like, "Is this April Fool's or is this real?" Like comments on the old X machine. But yeah, no, I stayed away. How about you, Rece?
No, in fact, I made it through the day mostly without even realizing it was April Fool's Day. I think the only thing
That's when it's dangerous, by the way, when you're not aware.
Exactly. But the one thing I did, and immediately I recognized it early in the day and then didn't think about much after that. I think it was Tiger Woods' official account. I think so. And he talked about sleeping in a hyperbaric chamber, or maybe someone did it and saying, "Hey, and I'm coming back to play the Masters." And then I was like, "Oh, it's April 1st." But yeah. So I think we made it through unscathed. Stanford is losing Troy Taylor, or they've excused him from his duties. Andrew Luck taking over as general manager. They've hired Frank Reich as the interim coach. Ordinarily, when people make moves at this time of year, and we don't know the details, but Stanford obviously believed that Taylor's behavior was egregious enough to make this move and not listening to warnings. But speaking broadly, generally speaking, I'm not a big fan, haven't been in the past, of interim coaches on the collegiate level. For every Coach-O that catches lightning in a bottle and takes off, there are, multiple issues of program fractures and dissipation and complete rebuild. I'm not sure that it serves anyone, but that's the old way of thinking. And in this particular case, with Andrew Luck as the GM, and not just because it's Andrew, but because of the way they're structuring their program, the way that a lot of this has become much like free agency as opposed to recruiting and, building something for a long period of time. Not that you're not trying to do that, but because you can replenish a roster in a different fashion. And a lot of it is, can you make the best offers and do the best job of in free agency? I'm not as bothered by this one, and also, Stanford's 3-9 last year. I'm not sure they can get a lot worse. Frank Reich is a guy who's had success as a head coach. I don't look at it and go, "What in the world are they doing?" The way I might have in the past, prior to the way business is conducted now. What are your thoughts?
So I just think Stanford is such a unique place, Rece. You and I have been out there a bunch over the years, and I think this is a good hire in a sense of you are going to install the identity of Stanford football. Look, they're not going to run the option at Stanford, right? When they have been good, if you look back at the last two generations, it has been with John Elway and Andrew Luck and a downfield passing game and pro sensibilities, be it from Bill Walsh, be it from Jim Harbaugh. That is what Stanford is at its best to look like, an NFL factory where you can sell that. So I think bringing in Frank Reich, to bring in NFL sensibilities, to bring in a coach who's called plays in the Super Bowl, to bring in a 500 level, 500 NFL coach is a very good football coach if you're that good. It's like Bill O'Brien was a 500 football coach at the Houston Texans. Like, that's a very good coach who's coached a lot of football. It also is an indelible, really the first indelible stamp of Andrew Luck on the program was the dismissal of Troy Taylor and hiring of Frank Reich. This is the identity that we are going to see Stanford football. Reich was one of Luck's favorite coaches. He was his coach's final year in 2018 in Indy. I read yesterday on the X machine that he married Andrew and his wife Nicole. So there's a deep seated tie there that is very real. And so this is Andrew Luck calling an old friend and saying, "Hey, I need your help for a year," and then coming and going in. And if you're a player at Stanford, you're going to be like, "Okay, I want to go to the NFL. This guy's going to know how to get me there." And if you're a recruit, you can say, "Okay, this is what it's going to eventually look like." Like I can't imagine someone's going to come in and drastically, identity-wise, especially on offense, be drastically different. It's hard to get a college coach to come in and say, "Hey, these are all your coaches in front office." That's a tough set of rules for a college guy to come in. So I think it's a good needle thread here. And I agree with you. Generally, interims, I think like Jim Grobe at Baylor, those kind of things, like outside interims are pretty rare and they're temporary. I think this one has a little more resonance. And I think you have a chance to win some games in the margins if you're Stanford with him as the coach.
Well, and I think too, one of the things you always worry about, even I think, as I mentioned a moment ago with the free agency type, who can make the best offer type of recruiting that's out there now. But you also worry about, in the past, recruiting. That would be the thing. Oh, if we do this, it's going to kill recruiting. We do, we're going to lose all of this time recruiting. And I'm not one of those guys who says that Stanford, Vanderbilt, the Ivies, they're not purer than the driven snow. I'm not suggesting that. But I am suggesting that their pool of recruits is by definition smaller. And so there are people out there that will not be admitted to the university that might be great players that they don't have to recruit because they can't. So you've made the pool smaller from which you are recruiting. And within that pool, there are people who certainly aspire to play in the NFL, but they also aspire to get a degree from Stanford. And that, in some cases, might be as important to many, or at least close to as important, maybe in some rare cases that it is more important. So you are a little bit ahead of the game in that regard, or at least the damage will be mitigated because of that in this interim period. So I'm sure that the others who do recruit against Stanford, the select few, will be able to point and say, well, you don't even know who your coach is going to be, and you can come here and get a comparable education. My friend Rod Gilmore might dispute my last statement, but you can come there and get a comparable education because education is largely what you make of it. But I think that they will use that against them, but I do think it wouldn't be as damaging as it might be at another school. And absent using an example and someone getting insulted, I would say insert state university here.
Run-of-the-mill SEC school. Why? Yeah.
Yeah, well, or Big 12 or Big 10. Just to avoid, or who do we leave out? Or American, whoever it might be. But that's kind of how I look at this. I think it can work out. And the thing is, even though Frank Reich is starting out in a big hole, he's the perfect guy to get you out of a hole. You know why, Pete?
So you hinted at this before the podcast taping, and it didn't click. But now I think I'm recalling this from my prepubescent childhood. Did Frank Reich lead the greatest wild card comeback in NFL history?
That he did.
Against the Houston Oilers, correct?
That is correct for the Buffalo Bills. But
what was the score?
41-38. They were down 32 points at one point. But wow. Young Pete, and I love the way you act like you're so much younger than I am. But young Victor Peter Thamel, that is not the comeback to which I referred prior to the podcast. There was another comeback. Some would argue even greater. Because 1984, I believe, the Maryland Terrapins facing the Miami Hurricanes, down 31-0, Pete, 31-0 at halftime. Oof. Stan Gelbaugh out, Frank Reich in, 42-40 Terps. 3 touchdowns in the third quarter to get him back in it. Two passing, one on the ground.
Wow.
And at the time, prior to the Michigan State comeback against Northwestern, it was the biggest comeback in college football history. And there might have been bigger ones in the interim, but as I recall, I think the Michigan State Northwestern 38-0 comeback or 38-3, whatever that was, I think exceeded that. That was the first one to exceed it, I think.
Yeah.
So you got the right guy
so I
on
don't
the farm
have
to dig him out of a hole, right?
Yeah. I don't have that. Let me ask you this. Let's spin forward here with Frank Reich and Andrew Luck, because I do think this is a really interesting macro topic. To my knowledge, Rece, Andrew Luck is the only GM in college football with full autonomy, hiring, firing coaches, roster. There's even, I remember when we wrote the story about him taking the job, like he's in charge of game day experience, right? Like it's almost, there's some team president-esque rules there. It's just a very different thing. In 10 years from now, how many schools will have a GM overseeing things in a similar way?
Man, I think it's a tough question to answer until you know exactly what the revenue sharing looks like.
Yeah, that's very fair.
If the revenue sharing is more etched in stone and everyone's sort of in largely the same boat, and as it pertains to how they can supplement that with NIL and all of those things, then I don't think the number will be as huge as you think. But I think that for the schools that aren't the big time traditional powers, that you'll see a lot of it. I think if you still need to be, if you can be ultra creative in your ancillary income for your players, your NIL above and beyond the revenue sharing, then you might see more of it because that person would need to focus on that and roster building. I have a hard time foreseeing a day that the winning coach at a winning coach at places like insert SEC power here.
Let's just say Kirby Smart, probably top coach in the game.
Kirby Smart, Dabo Swinney,
sure.
Nick Saban was there. I don't know. I hesitate to put Ryan Day after 1 year in that mix just because of the volatile nature there. But you get the drift. If Ryan Day wins another national championship, then he would probably be in this category too.
The two-title club is a pretty small club.
Yeah, and there won't be anyone more powerful than he. He will be, that person will be in charge. But you take another school that is aspiring to win championships and get there, and maybe that's the path they view as being best for $1 to Seth Greenberg, the roster construction that's needed, that's needed in order to compete at the highest level. I would say it would still be a mix, and so much of it will depend on what does the revenue sharing look like. If everybody is in an NFL model, largely the same boat, then maybe you could argue it would be more prevalent. Then I sort of think it might be sort of the same old. You'll have a GM helping the head coach. But if it becomes something else where it's above and beyond, way beyond football, that you've got to figure out the money, you got to get the money in, you got to get it distributed, you got to reach out to the players, and there's just not enough time really for an aspiring coach. Then you have someone doing that, and then they probably then have the juice to make the move that Andrew just made in terms of that. I don't want us to appear that we're dodging the obvious, and I will stipulate at the beginning the specifics of Troy Taylor's demeaning, belittling behavior that he was accused of, which largely led to his exit. Do you think, even at Stanford, and you and I have talked a little bit about, you need to know where you are, and that was a big failing on his part, that he clearly didn't understand where he was or didn't care or thought he was above it. And that is without saying, I don't know precisely what he did other than the generalities that have been written about. If Troy Taylor had been, well, certainly if he had been 9-3, I think things were different. But if Troy Taylor had been 6-6, 7-5 last 2 years instead of 3-9 each year, you think Andrew Luck and Stanford still go down this path? I'm skeptical of that, just to be honest about it.
That's hard to say. That the firing to me, Rece, because they knew everything before it went public, fell in the Jeremy Foley category of what must be done eventually should be done immediately. Right? Like
Yeah.
Troy Taylor was going to be on the hot seat regardless of extracurricular activity going into this season. And I fully expected him to be fired. And in August, I probably would have said on this podcast, if I had to bet on the coach who's fired first, it would probably be him, right? Because it just, there appeared to be the need for a reset there. So as for what Troy Taylor did, I obviously read the investigative story that ESPN did. He has his own side. It ultimately just didn't end up being a great look at a place that image matters. And so at that point, you can't put yourself in position as a head coach to be in the crosshairs of those complaints. You can't do it. Here's what I think is interesting going forward. Do you think, as Stanford now has a 8-month opening, right? Do you think the prospect of working for Andrew Luck is going to be attractive to veteran up-and-coming head coach, who we assume they're going to get? Or do you think that's a deterrent? They're skeptical of that because it's just so new. I'm not convicted in the answer, but I'm curious to see how the market reacts.
Young up-and-coming coach who can elevate his position, who may not be widely known, attractive. Veteran guy who's had a head coaching job maybe is not at the level or at the program that he ultimately desires, but feels like he's established enough credibility to get there, deterrent. So that's going to be the dividing line in their coaching search. Unless there's someone with whom Andrew already has a relationship with, like Frank Reich, then obviously that changes things. But if you're just going out and selling, to a coach, hey, come work with Andrew Luck. If you are, coming from a Mountain West job and people don't really, know you household across the country, you don't have this big reputation that you're the rising star, but you've been winning some, then it's probably attractive. If you are in, let's say, the Big 12, and you might not have that reputation yet, but you've started to establish it, and you're going to be on the short list for the big-time powers when those openings become available, deterrent, because you want to be able to chart your own course. So I do think that's going to limit the pool for Stanford a little bit in who Andrew can recruit. And some guys won't. Some of the things that you just mentioned about Troy Taylor, and this is a Cal guy, how he behaved as if he were allegedly behaved as if he were somewhat oblivious to the nuances of being on the farm is a little surprising. But if you look at that situation, you have to look at the guys too who are willing to go into a place that views itself as a bastion of academia, that they are going to take the classes seriously. They're not going to allow you to skip classes for a rearranging football practice schedule. Those things are going to be different. And I don't know how Stanford is. A lot of places now, guys just go to class online anyway. I don't know if Stanford's that way or not. But there will be less leeway there. And a coach that goes into that situation has to be comfortable with that. And those two things are going to limit the pool. It doesn't mean they can't get a great coach. They can. It's just some guys won't be as interested in those two dynamics, I think.
So I want to be clear. It was made very clear to me that this is a 1-year deal for Frank Reich, right? This isn't an audition.
He's not going to go win the job. Yeah.
He's not going to
because he doesn't want to, right?
Correct. He doesn't want to. But
yeah.
I will just pass this on, agnostic of Frank Reich and Stanford. One thing I have learned in many years of covering this coaching carousel, Rece, is that there is a power to the interim that should never be ignored. All right. I can go back to Clay Helton, Spencer Danielson, Blake Harrell at East Carolina in the last cycle, David Braun at Northwestern. There are 8 months of human dynamics, relationships, adversities, overcoming, winning locker rooms. I'm not saying Frank Reich's going to be the next coach at Stanford because I've been told very directly that there's not a chance of that happening. But just don't underestimate ever the power of the interim. The interim has a power, and there have been mistakes made from that power, quite frankly. Ed Orgeron, right? Your favorite interim example.
Not favorite interim example, the patron saint of interim coaching. LSU Tigers, go to work. Go Tigers.
Remember at USC, he gave everybody cookies and everybody. Like that was like the was like giving
Having a
a
cookie.
like, what was wrong? Oh, he's just gonna give Big Loudon a cookie. But yeah, the cookie principle, we can call this, is just like never underestimate the interim coach in a dynamic. Like so much human happens during an interim period that, because I remember watching it happen in East Carolina. They started flat, won a bunch of games in a row, and all of a sudden the players are rallying around him. They're going in the media. This guy deserves the job. We love Coach Harrell. And look, good for Blake Harrell. He earned that job. Spencer Danielson, same thing. Like they fired Andy Avalos after a win. Mm-hmm. And then he just went and won the Mountain West, and the guys love him. I've never heard a player, when there's an interim coach, be like, no, we really want the guy who's the up and coming at, fill in the blank directional state. Like,
a lot of times they don't know him.
Correct.
They have relationships with these guys.
Yeah. So that is an agnostic power of the interim. Every time an interim coach comes, I remember when Clay Helton was interim at USC, and I was like, early in my career, I was like, there's no way they're going to give the job to this guy. Oh, they gave the job to that guy. And you know what? But history would show he did a pretty good job.
He did a good job, and I won't repeat the somewhat snarky line that I remember distinctly delivering on game day, because I feel like it would be targeting against the previous people there, and I don't want to do that because things have changed for those. But I will say it in a less snarky way. At that moment, what they needed was someone who had no distractions in his life. It was just football. And Clay Helton delivered that. And probably what Stanford needs right now is someone who's willing to come in, work with Andrew Luck, coach the team, has football expertise, and doesn't have designs on winning the job outright. The one thing I will say that also goes along with the power of the interim coach is if Stanford were to overperform with Frank Reich, and Frank goes, hey, it's not so bad. This is a nice place to live. This is a good setup.
Ride my bike to work every day. I mean, the one thing about Stanford, every coach I've ever met there is like great kids, coaching great kids, great people. There's worse places to live in America than Palo Alto, which is at times the most expensive zip code in the country. Like there's worse places to go. So I'm just mentioning that is a lesson that I have learned, and a mistake that I have made in evaluating the coaching carousel.
Yeah. So I think the interim thing goes both ways, and we're not suggesting that these two guys, Andrew Luck and Frank Reich, aren't telling the truth.
I think they've been very clear.
This is absolutely the plan. Yeah, this is absolutely the plan.
Yes.
But
plans
change. Plans change. Your plans can change sometimes.
Human dynamics can
what did you think of? I thought, and I think we touched on this earlier in the pod. I'm not sure if we were together, but Deion Sanders gets the big extension.
Yeah.
I'm not at all surprised that he's staying at Colorado for a number of reasons. One, things that I've said several times on this podcast, he's an old school, tough guy beneath some of the charismatic, flashy surface that I do think genuinely gets some enjoyment and reward out of helping people and helping players. And so he can do that there. That's one thing. He's been successful. That's two things. And the other thing is I cannot imagine, Pete, Deion Sanders leaving after Shedeur leaves and allowing the people who said he will leave after Shedeur leaves to be right. That's another. So there was a hat trick of things working in Colorado's favor, and I think that they were wise to do it because, again, different methodology at Stanford now at play starting. Deion's not going out and recruiting, and I ain't hard to find. All of that. That's working for them. So maybe it's another lesson in that if you can identify what works for your program and with whom, you don't have to do it by the old school blueprint in order to have success. Can
we play a game?
Yes, please do.
You and I, like I would say, we're probably in the higher end of like minutia college football nerd trivia knowledge, right?
Uh-oh. I got you once. Now you're about to get me. All right, go ahead.
All right.
What do you got?
And this is to accentuate the impact of Coach Prime. AI just told me on a Google search that applications rose 20% at Colorado since Coach Prime. We all know where to find him. I told the story on this podcast before that, like the morning after their wild Colorado State game 2 years ago, I was on the playground in South Boston, and like the moms of the kids Teddy's age were talking about Colorado football. And I was like, where am I? They don't even like college football here. Never mind. Like, it was just the weirdest. Well, it was one of those moments where I was like, oh, this is like real. Like this is reaching places before. So Dan Hawkins, our former colleague, and I'd call Dan a friend. I've known him since I started in this thing. He gets fired in 2010. Can you, Rece Davis, name all the Colorado coaches in order since Dan Hawkins' departure?
Okay, I think I can name them, but I'm a little fuzzy on the order of a couple of them. Okay, you got John Embry.
That's good. That would be the hardest one, I would think.
Yeah, and you've got, and the most recent one was Carl Durrell.
Yes,
but I don't know if Mike McIntyre was before or after Embry. I'm going to say. Wait a minute. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to say. Yeah. Right. Because they had the really good season there, and that was after Embry. So I'll say. After Hawkins, I will say. Boy, was there somebody before it? Was there someone before Embry?
No, there was not.
Okay, Embry, McIntyre, Durrell. Is that right?
It is right, except you forgot about one pivotal character who dropped in for a year, left, and then committed the single dumbest mistake a coach has made in history. $90 million.
What? Give it to what am I forgetting?
Mad Mel Tucker.
Oh, how can I forget this?
2019.
Because
he bounced after a 5-7 season, and then Kenneth Walker ran wild. He got the big contract, and then we all know what happened to Mel Tucker.
Well, there is first time revealed on the podcast, I think. This is so dumb of me to forget Mel Tucker, and I'm going to tell you why. My daughter is getting married in September.
Yes,
her fiance is a huge. He's a Colorado alum.
That's right.
Family Colorado alums.
Yep.
His dad, was in the know with the whole Mel Tucker situation, and authored the word that was used in the Sports Illustrated story of that Mel Tucker hoodwinked them, by that infamous meeting, I think, at the Denver Country Club, where he reiterated to everybody in the room,
then he did a media tour.
Yeah, and then
about staying.
Yeah, and then by that night, he was on the plane, right? To East Lansing.
He was gone.
I can't believe I forgot that. That's part of my whole repertoire now. Whenever I mention Colorado, but
So I bring up
everybody from Colorado has tried to forget that.
Yes, no, and they certainly have in East Lansing too.
Right.
So I bring up that list of generally indistinguished, although Mike McIntyre did have one good year. I believe they made the Pac-12 title game.
He did, yes.
Yeah, but that's a generally undistinguished 15-year-ish run, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have Coach Prime, and he has just come in and made that place electric. He has transformed the university. A 20% jump in applications is just, that's like mind-bending. That's like winning a national title bump without winning a national title. So they have made Colorado cool. I mean, Juju Lewis is there. That's pretty wild. If you had said when Juju was coming up the high school ranks and committed to USC, Georgia was, barking up his tree loud. They have something going there. And look, Prime made some adjustments, learned some staff things. Like we've seen him, he just hasn't showed up and kept static. He has kept growing and evolving. And I give him all the credit. I was a skeptic, Rece. I think there's plenty of podcast fodder here that would show that. And they've done it. I am very curious to see if he will not do it without two of the top 4 picks in the upcoming NFL draft. Like, it's going to be a new identity. This is his biggest challenge as a head coach by far this season, but there is certainly enough empirical evidence to show that they'll be competitive again in the Big 12.
And, and if they take a half step back, meaning that they're closer to 500 as opposed to competing as they were deep into November to get to the conference championship game, it does not mean it's not working. Because a lot of programs who are on the rise, not everybody has been what, Georgia and Alabama and Ohio State have been, where you just plug in the next quarterback and things largely go along swimmingly, or at least, really well. Yeah. So when you're changing quarterbacks and you take away the Heisman Trophy winner, if they fall back and they're still competitive and they're around 500, it doesn't mean it's going sideways.
That means it's generally better than that indistinguished run we just covered.
Yes. I remember calling a game there when John Embry was there against, a pretty good but not great Arizona State team on Thursday night. And it was 43-7 at halftime or something like that. That might not have been exactly.
Did old Todd Graham get him?
Yeah, he did, but that was Todd Graham. 43-7 actually was the halftime score when Todd Graham faced Oregon a couple of weeks later, I believe. Marcus Mariota. Before we wrap this up, you and I both headed to San Antonio for the basketball Final Four. One thing that struck me about this, only the second time in history that all 4 1 seeds as seeding began have made it to the Final Four. The other was in San Antonio in 2008.
I was there. That was a bad deadline night.
Yeah, there's this idea about whether the tournament is better when you have Cinderellas or whether it is better when you have all of the favorites, which is rare, which, by the way, is the most aggressive, outlandish pick you can make in this, one-shot deal tournament. Say all the 1 seeds are going to get there, or, all 1s and 2s or something. But
I killed Jeff Borzello on this podcast for picking all 4 1s. And I know Billis did it too, and I'm sure you killed him. I just was like, come on, man. Like,
I really didn't. People say that. I picked, and, this is going to sound like revisionist history. I picked Michigan State, and sometimes I thought possibly. I didn't really believe it, to be honest, but I was sitting there thinking, I don't know what everybody's going to pick when we fill out those brackets. And we do so hurriedly that it does. The way we do it, and there's nothing wrong with it, there's no choice, but it lends itself to chalky picks because you're doing it in commercial breaks and you're filling it out. And from watching all season, the 5 seed's better than the 12. There might be a 12 here and there that you kind of like or whatever, but they're better. And, you don't know if they're going to win, but they've proven to be better. So you do this and you get really chalky. So I get to the end and I have all 4 1 seeds and I'm sitting there thinking, we're all going to have the same Final Four if I do this. So I said, okay, among these, who's showing some signs of vulnerability? And at that moment, Auburn had lost in the tournament. They had lost their final 2 regular season games. They lost 3 of their last 4 games. So I said, okay, I had 1, 2. I'll take a flyer and go Michigan State there just so it all doesn't look the same. And also, I took Houston to get to the championship game. I was convinced and would not change the Florida pick. Obviously, even though I think Houston has a chance, I'd pick Duke. But anyway, we go to all of those, and I see all these people saying, "Oh, that's terrible." That's actually the lowest percentage pick you can make. I mean, you're picking the best teams, but it's happened now twice.
Yes.
But is that better? And then you think back to football and you say, well, we want football to look more like the basketball tournament with Cinderellas. Now we got, whatever it was. Ohio State was the 8 seed. What Notre Dame was the 5, I guess. No, Notre Dame was the 7, right? Yeah, Notre Dame was the 7 seed, I think. So you got 7 versus 8, but you can hardly call that Cinderella. So I don't, which is better to you, to get the big powers or to get the highest seeded teams?
So I think at this point in the NCAA basketball tournament, I just want the best teams. I want really good teams. I want stars. I think this is an awesome Final Four. I mean, it couldn't be a better Final Four. Because you have, this isn't always the case with the Final Four of the last decade or so. You have big, searing superstars. Like, it's rare that you get the top 2 player of the year candidates there. It's been rare in college basketball. You have the number 1 pick in the draft who's come through. Remember, Anthony Edwards didn't make the NCAA tournament when he was at Georgia, and he's arguably the best young player in the NBA. So when you have Cooper Flagg surrounded by 2 other lottery picks and some really good college players too. And then you have Janai Broome, who's had that awesome season. And then you have this consummate gritty team in Houston, who has very good players too, by the way. And then you have this like super team 1-9 in Florida that I think you and I both left Gainesville when we were there for College Game Day, pretty convinced we were going to pick them to win the title. Like the way they beat Auburn combined with seeing them live in practice, that it was like, man, like there's so many pieces.
So again, another dollar to Seth Greenberg, Noah's Ark, two of everything.
Yep. That's it. That is a very good line. I think I don't recall a Final Four where I've been like, all four teams can really win this. Usually there's sort of one like team that's kind of coming in, like hot or on a run, or there's like a magic story. No, these are four fundamentally sound, really good basketball teams, and I think we're gonna get two great games out of this race. I really am. I'm really excited about the prospect of that. Can I tell a story from the San Antonio Final Four with 4 1s?
Please do.
So I was working for a newspaper then, and newspapers used to be printed on a printing press. And so you would have very difficult deadlines on night games that start East Coast at 9, whatever o'clock. So if you recall that title game, Memphis was in control and was going to win. And I was ready and writing the whole second half because I had to send right at the buzzer. So with about 1:35 to go, Derrick Rose hit a 3 right in front of me, left wing. And I sent my story. I forget what it put him up, but I was like, this thing's done. It's over. And I just sat there rooting against Kansas because I had this, and Chalmers balls in the air, and I'm looking, I'm like, oh no. And then like, you just have to start over, which is like not a great, no, it was overtime. So like got a little bit of time, but I was just like, oh, fudgesicle.
And like, but he didn't say fudge.
Yeah. But it was like, there's a good feeling when you're a print journalist in your old days, built around, you hit send. And then it was just like everything unraveled at that point. I want to say Chris Douglas Roberts missed some free throws.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe a front end. And I was just like, it was melting down in front of me. And it's why I can't gamble in my job, but I won't, because that must feel like to like be a better and have like the lead, whittle away in front of you. Okay. So anyway, pardon my indulgence, but when I think of San Antonio, I think of that Derrick Rose 3 and then everything that went wrong conspiring. And I'm not going to go look it up, but I'm sure I wrote a terrible story off of Mario Chalmers in that moment.
Okay, well, let me ask you an inside baseball question about that. When you sent the story with a minute and a half left or whatever it was, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, even though you're in communication with your editors then once Chalmers hits a shot, once Kansas went, that you're rewriting.
Mm-hmm.
Describe the level of fear that somehow, some way, there will be an early edition of the paper that will have the earlier story, which said Memphis won, and you have a whole Dewey beats Truman situation for you history buffs out there.
No level of fear. I can understand why you'd ask the question, but they're all watching it in the office, right? So,
but there may be some dude back in the print room or whatever who's not. He's like, got this one, put it on the paper, and off you go.
We had at the New York Times a salty old editor named Carl Nelson. He would always hang up the phone before he'd be like, "You gonna send, Chief?" And then he'd hang up. So the other terrible deadline title game was St. Louis. Do you remember it was a very good Illinois-North Carolina title game that year in 05?
Sure. 05. Yep.
Yeah. So sometimes what you do, because you don't know who's going to win, is you write like a generic lead that sets the scene. That way you just have something down and then you can fill it in. So it was a great game, and I had a lead about like the arch and out west or something like that. And he calls me and he goes, "On your right through, skip the geography lesson, Chief." That's a polite way to say your story sucks.
Well, the geography lesson that sometimes we use for the scene set in College Game Day. What was this cat's name again?
Carl Nelson.
Carl Nelson. If Carl Nelson told me that I couldn't mention the banks of the Olentangy or beside the Red Cedar, I'd tell Carl Nelson to kick rocks.
Carl Nelson used the F word as like a verb, an adjective, like a lot of different things. But he closed a lot of news pages in his day. He was a good editor, good guy, and like you need someone who like is pretty calm at that point.
So he learned English from coaches. And if he used the F word in every part of speech.
Yes. No, okay. There was a lot of there was a lot of that. No, you didn't get a lot of compliments from old Carl. That was for sure. And I learned to not have geography lessons in my lead after St. Louis.
Hey, Carl, you don't like this scene set? Kick rocks, Pally. All right, Pete. I will see you in San Antonio. Ought to be a great Final Four. Looking forward to that. It should be fun. And then off to the NFL draft, and then off to the off season leading up to college football. And there will be plenty of off season stories.
I'm sure it'll be quiet between the draft and the off season.
I'll have nothing to write about. So that'll be good.
I'm sure. Always.
I mean, it's not like we don't know like how the sport's going to operate when it starts next year. So I mean, there's really what's there to write about?
What could happen? What could go wrong? Thanks for listening to the College Game Day Podcast. Remember to download wherever you prefer to get podcasts, or better yet, subscribe and never miss a single episode.